before the presentation, I would like to share a few words in Japanese. このプレゼンテーションは全部英語ですけど、いつかの文は日本語で、訳しています。でも、多分間違えている可能性が高い。だから、ごめんなさい。じゃあ、英語で戻りましょうか。So, okay. Okay, it looks, yeah. So I will be here sharing the slides. Looks like this is not working, but it's fine. So my talk today, I guess it's a little bit different from what you are used to see in SODACON. In fact, it's my first SODACON event, and I'm not really involved in SODACON project and SODACON Foundation, but actually I would love to. Today I'm going to be talking about what OSPOs can do and the role of OSPOs in multi-cloud data management. First, a little bit of myself. I'm the OSPO program manager at TODO Group. That is a Linux Foundation project that is a group of OSPO practitioners that are helping to create OSPO resources, tooling, to build more OSPOs worldwide in an effective way and successfully. I previously was at Bitergia, that was a software development analytics company focused on open source and inner source metrics standards and metrics strategy. 2 years ago, I finished my master's degree in data science. Awesome, thank you. And also, right now, I'm involved not only in TODO Group, but other open source communities such as OpenChain, Chaos, DevRel Collective, or Inner Source Commons. So today's agenda, I guess some people are unfamiliar about OSPOs, so I would like to do a brief introduction of what is the OSPO and the evolution and the status of OSPOs. Then I will deep dive more into what OSPOs can do within the multi-cloud data management ecosystem, share some ideas for potential collaboration between both communities, and the resources links that I will be sharing. And for those who are wondering, what is this? So this is the TODO Group's mascot and OSPO mascot that is called OSPO-T, because it's like OSPO and mochi, because it looks like a mochi for me. So first of all, about OSPO evolution. To give you some context, I would like to start with a quick question. What do you think that are the risks if organizations do open sourcing correctly? Because maybe 10 years ago, you will say, well, there is not really risk, but right now, everything runs on software, and software eventually runs in open source as well. So we're seeing a lot of modern applications contain open source components. Organizations, whether they like it or not, they are using open source. And that entails commitment. That means organizations need to take conscious of the open source and start not only using it, but learn how to effectively contribute back to those projects. Because when we think about like all the vulnerabilities that has been happening over the past years, sometimes there's people that says, well, see, this is a good example of why open source is not working. Well, open source isn't broken. Sometimes the problem is the organizations that they're using open source and they don't do anything further than that, and don't think about like the responsibility, the commitment that needs to be done in order to, if they really want to engage in open source. So within this context, there are two ways of embracing open source. The first thought that companies and organizations can think about is ad hoc open source. So since I'm using open source, there will be risk, there will be a vulnerability, there will be issues along the way, across the way, within the whole path. So organizations, instead of being commitment to open source, they just maybe put some efforts to fix an issue, to fix a problem. But since there is no a centralized place of these open source operations, this problem might be repeating over and over and over. You will be losing money, you will be losing time and spend a lot of time on the same issue. And that is a way of doing open source, right? But then there are organizations that they see a strategy and they put the means, the time and effort to build a strategy around open source. That means working on all the processes and all the tooling needed to start engaging with open source and all the means to not only from using but also contributing to it. And I think this graph can visualize quite well like this idea of doing open source versus doing strategic open source. So ad hoc open source might be tempting to do at the very beginning because of course you solve the issue, it's quick, doesn't need a lot of resources, but it's not gonna scale at all because the problem is gonna repeat over and over. But if you start building policies and processes around open source and your organization is ready to adopt open source, maybe at the very beginning it's going to take a time until you see efforts, but it's going to ensure continuity of open source within the organization. So the vehicle to achieve this, sometimes called the OSPO. OSPO comes from Open Source Program Office, and we've seen that over the past year, it has been growing a lot. This comes from the TODO group survey we do every year to see the pulse of OSPOs across the years. So we started this survey series in 2018, and we saw that the last year was, there's an OSPO consolidation, like more organizations are really thinking about a strategy around open source. And we've also seen that OSPOs are enabling open source sustainability. Like with OSPOs, organizations can better understand open source, can better know how to engage in open source and the projects, and make quality contributions to those open source projects. So in a nutshell, OSPO is basically that, is a way to put a strategy on top of the organization's open source efforts, is the centralized place of the organization's open source operations. And it has many benefits that can be grouped in 4 areas. It brings, it allows to bridge the cultural gap between the traditional software and the open source software best practices. It allows continuity, since it allows sustainability in the long term of open source within the organization. It allows to create or to improve new tooling, since in order to contribute to open source, in order to engage to open source, these organizations usually need to automate process, and that means building new tools dedicated to that, or contributing to existing tools to help them on that. And of course, and I think this is one of the most important parts, it embraces open source education within the organization, because I think that it's quite important when organizations really want to engage, but maybe their teams doesn't know how to engage in open source. Open source is communities of communities. It's a really complex ecosystem. So it needs certain training and mentorship programs to get started. But before I start, we've seen that OSPOs is something interesting to consider, whether or not you have an OSPO in your organization. But to give you some initial steps to start with, here are some questions to ask before building an OSPO that can help you to not only decide or not if it's the right time to build an OSPO, but how are you going to build your OSPO? Because one thing we said into the group is that one size does not fit all, and there are really different ways to build an OSPO depending on your organization's industry, your goals, and so on. Okay, so after this introduction, I think we can now, because this was like more overall OSPOs, I think we can now deep dive more into, okay, can OSPOs help in the multi-cloud data management ecosystem? Is it worth it? So for that, I will like to share one case study, one example. And focus more in the in one use case that happened in Europe. So we've seen that the expansion of big data, machine learning, and AI usage is increasing. For instance, in the car industry, it is used to predict machine malfunction, vehicle data diagnosis, and also the creation of artificial intelligent virtual agents. So we've seen, and I guess in the SODA Foundation, you will know this better than me, it is key right now, and engaging in open source in that area is also really important. So this was a case study that we did in the TODO group 2 years ago, I guess, by the TODO European community that studied the case of open source software in the European automotive industry. So in this project, the automotive grade Linux, there was a lot of OSPOs from Europe involved. So these OSPOs created and enabled this collaboration of automakers, suppliers, and technology companies, and they worked together for a common goal that was to accelerate the development adoption of a fully open software stack for the connected car. So I wanted to highlight that example because it's a clear way to see how OSPOs can enable open source sustainability. Because OSPOs helps open source in many different ways. OSPOs, in fact, act as the linchpin between the organization and the open source ecosystem. So it is true that they are working, they have that internal part, that is how can we enable, how can we infuse open source learning within the organization, but it's also the external face for the organization. So when they need to collaborate and to communicate with foundations, with open source projects, with communities, is that visible place where those foundations and the developers from the open source projects can reach out to if they need to, and also to other organizations. The example I shared before, some people has been calling that term like federated OSPOs. So OSPOs from several organizations within an industry that work together and put efforts to work on common tooling for a specific purpose. So the OSPO formation within the multi-cloud data management ecosystem could help to first enhance quality contributions and catalyze innovation, and second, better coordinate and communicate between the SODA Foundation's open source projects and the organizations involved. Because from the many responsibilities that an OSPO can take, there are two clear ones in their activity list that they need to take care of. That will be like manage the open source IT infrastructure and collaborate with open source organizations. So as I was saying, OSPOs have different patterns. And the pattern that we were seeing in previously about the European organizations working on the automotive grade Linux is one of them. The OSPO can take this industry collaborative pattern. We've seen real examples of OSPOs making that happening, like, as I said, the automotive companies for the European Union. So those are OSPOs collaborating with other OSPOs to improve open source innovation from industry-specific needs. But there is also another pattern that is called the cross-industry collaborative. So these are more like OSPOs collaborating with other OSPOs to improve innovation for open source tooling. So maybe, for instance, this example was Bloomberg worked with Microsoft to make contributions to TypeScript. Of course, there are different industries, comes from different industry verticals, but they had a common goal that was like, well, we are using TypeScript, we should be working together to have a solution and in the open source verse. So if we translate these patterns into the multi-cloud data ecosystem, the way that we could see this will be to, well, the OSPO for every organization can be right in the middle, acting as this linchpin between the other organizations involved in this SODA Foundation and all the different foundations and open source projects and communities that are related with this ecosystem and the different projects within the SODA Foundation, of course. So now I would like to share some ideas to where SODA and TODO could be collaborating in the next year or maybe in the future to help to build more OSPOs and help open source sustainability within the multi-cloud data management ecosystem. And why? First of all, like why is important this collaboration? Well, because even though in TODO we have a lot of resources to start building an OSPO, that is not enough. As I said earlier, one size does not fit all. So your OSPO is not my OSPO, and that means that we need to collaborate across industry verticals to find and discover new OSPO patterns, the same ones that I shared with you in the previous slides. There are more to be uncovered, but those patterns are not being discovered if we don't collaborate. So we need to find ways to make that collaboration happen. For those unfamiliar to TODO, we've been here for a long time now. We are now more than 80 organizations and more than 1,800 OSPO practitioners that has been helping to build those resources. And we specialize in 5 strategic areas. We help on building tooling for OSPOs. for the different OSPO responsibilities. We also focus on research, such as, for instance, the OSPO surveys, provide network spaces across different regions and like OSPO local meetups and networking spaces, working groups, and so on. We also provide training and education, such as the TODO guides, such as the OSPO 101 training course, and so on. And these are some of the resources that the community has been contributing over the past years. So there's white papers and reports on how to start an OSPO, TODO guides and best practices, studies, use cases from other OSPOs, and sharing the OSPO journey, and the OSPO mind map that tries to map all the different responsibilities, size, behavior, and roles that an OSPO can take. And also, we have the OSPO Associates program for those open source projects and foundations that are helping the OSPO movement and would like to collaborate with TODO group. So for instance, LF Energy, OpenChain, Finance, Chaos, all of them started to collaborate with TODO to find new areas of improvement that OSPOs are demanding. A good example is the latest OSPO metrics working group that was created within Chaos. Chaos is a Linux Foundation project as well, focused on community health analytics metrics. So in order to measure the OSPO value and the OSPO success within the organization, a lot of OSPOs needed some kind of standardized metrics to look for. So that is why both communities are working together now in the OSPO metrics working groups to define those metrics. And also another example of collaboration is an initiative that is happening in Europe, that we are doing this OSPOlogy Live series that happens every quarter. And so for instance, the next one will be in the Netherlands. And what we are doing is, well, this is not just a TODO initiative, but it's co-organized with the different initiatives that are helping at some point the OSPO movement, such as OpenSSF for open source security, XPDX, OpenChain for open source compliance and legal, Chaos for metrics and community health analytics, inner source commons to apply inner source principles and better infuse this open source knowledge within the organization, and so on. And these are basically like a 2-day workshop event where all the communities and participants gather together and start building new resources and new solutions for the specific regions. So to end up with, I would like to leave this as an open questions for all of you. Like, what do you think should be the next steps in both communities to build this collaboration and help to build OSPOs in this area, so organizations can help the open source ecosystem in a more sustainable way and become better open source citizens. And just to end up with a few takeaways from this talk, we've seen that the Open Source Program Office ensures continuous innovation and also helps open source sustainability within the organization. And the formation of the OSPOs within the multi-cloud data management ecosystem could help to enhance these quality contributions across the open source projects, including the projects behind the SODA Foundation. and also to better coordinate and communicate between the SODA Foundation's open source projects and the organizations involved, since you will have a centralized place to look for and also a centralized place to manage all these open source operations. So saying this, thank you so much. ありがとうございます。Presentation 来てくれてありがとうございます。And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks for the session. The question you mentioned about OSPO formation in multi-cloud ecosystem. What does that really mean? What is that entity you want to do? I mean, what kind of steps we can take to do it?
Yeah, let me go to this. Yeah, so basically what I will, the idea will be to, if these organizations, those organizations that engage in the SODA Foundation and in this industry to help on this tooling, because they are critical to the open source operations, can form a well-established OSPO that could help to improve these contributions. Because let me go again to this slide. Hold on. Yeah, so because what I've said here is that we are saying that those OSPOs that are being established, they are proving that they're helping to upstream contributions, because sometimes organizations engage in open source and they try to contribute to open source projects, but there is no contributions, or the quality of the contributions are really low. So how can we improve that? How can we make that these organizations really understands open source and really knows how to engage in open source and those open source projects? Well, so I see that the vehicle to allow this and to catalyze this open source innovation through OSPOs, and not having an organization with maybe not certain people working part-time in open source, but then you need to talk with another person to fix another issue. So instead of doing this ad hoc open source, having it as a centralized place, and know, because that can help also the organizations to better communicate with the organization, because they know where to communicate instead of going from one person to another trying to solve an issue, and vice versa. The organization will have this centralized place, and they will really know better how to assist the organization on, okay, which projects we will be using, which projects we will be contributing to align with our organization's objectives. I don't know if that answered your question.
To a great extent. So just to make it a bit more clear, we have a governance structure at SODA Foundation. We have board, TOC, UAC, outreach, and things like that. Mm-hmm. We also do some kind of improvement on mentoring, education, contribution standards and qualities. So you are suggesting something like we can have an OSPO entity in the governance and focus on those aspects which OSPO covers. Is that what you mean?
So there can be many ways. Let me, for instance, give you an example that we have done with we are doing with another industry. Like, for instance, with finance, for instance, we are seeing ways of how can we build a working group, or call it a working group, call it a SIG group, whatever, that can focus on OSPOs within the finance and banking ecosystem, that is finance. So instead of having like a OSPO general term, try to gather OSPOs that are working together to help on the different solutions for the finance and banking ecosystem. So that is one example that could be translated into this, but more from the data management, multi-cloud data management ecosystem. So those organizations which core industry is this multi-cloud data management ecosystem is critical for the daily operations. How can they make this consortium, this federated OSPOs, and work together. And for that, they will need a space, maybe, so where these OSPOs can talk and share learnings and also share best practices. Maybe the ones that exist there, but have it in a centralized place, like, okay, how can we ease that conversation across OSPOs and also allow this networking and mentoring some OSPOs that has been there in the long term with the new OSPOs, and then increase the OSPO adoption in more organizations that are willing to help in the projects from the SODA Foundation, for instance.
Sure, thanks, very clear.
Thanks, Anna. So it's a very great talks and nice Japanese. So I found no mistake in your Japanese. Thank you very much.